Next speaker is Richard Kennedy from the River Bush Salmon Station in Northern Ireland. Now, the River Bush, where studies have been going on for 40 or more years, suffers not only from the same reduction in marine survival that everywhere else does, but a significant decline in freshwater survival. And we're going to hear about the programme which has attempted to deal with all of that. Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction. My name is Richard Kennedy. I work at the River Bush Salmon Station in Northern Ireland, and I want to report on a case study, if you like, of salmon enhancement on a river system that is well monitored. So we have some information that we can share with you today in regards to that. Lots of contributors to this. It's not just my own work. A lot of colleagues involved in this as well, from my own organisation, AFBI, but also the Department of Culture, Arts and Leisure and Queen's University in Belfast. What I want to do today is go through a number of things, introduce you to the bush, the monitoring we do there, the pressures that the bush salmon stock is under, some of the enhancement that has been conducted over the last decade and a half, and then review that. What can we learn from the work that we've done and tried to monitor? So the River Bush is located in County Antrim on the north coast of Ireland. It's a medium-sized catchment, coastal spate river. The top of the river is actually impounded behind a reservoir, the top 3 kilometres of the headwaters. It flows through a fairly steep, high gradient portion with lots of really good nursery habitat. It then meanders down onto its agricultural lowland plain. In this area, the river has been subject to an arterial drainage scheme back in the 50s and 60s. And finally, it exits into the North Atlantic across a beach at Runkerry. Interestingly, the bush doesn't have an estuary as such. This is complete fresh water above the beach. Then it exits into the salt water. So the salmon station facilities were set up in the early 70s. They're based around a series of traps, upstream traps for the adults and downstream traps for the smolts. And we have a long-term database based around the data. So here you can see our smolt trap and our adult trap on the river. We also have extensive electrofishing that we undertake each and every year. We electrofish in excess of 130, nearly 140 sites each summertime looking for knot plus salmon. And in such a way we can monitor the entire life cycle of the salmon stock on the river. So some of the pressures and challenges to salmon production and fresh water on the River Bush. Key to the pressures, I guess, in freshwater are habitat issues. As I said before, we had an arterial drainage scheme in the river. We also have a problem in that we have quite spectacular weed growth over a lot of our spawning habitats, and that's caused some quite serious degradation in terms of the habitats the fish use to spawn on. Before the arterial drainage scheme, we didn't have ranunculus water crowfoot in the river. It was introduced after the scheme, and it's taken off like wildfire, and it's a real problem for us now, particularly near to spawning time. We have intensive agricultural practices, particularly in the lowland parts of the river, deterioration of the riparian zone as well in many places. And this is just some data to indicate the reduction in nursery habitat that was detected over a 20-year period, comparing habitat data derived from full catchment walkover surveys, looking at good quality nursery through to more moderate quality nursery. And you can see there was a reduction in quantity and quality of nursery habitat over that period of time. Partly, I guess, a legacy of the arterial drainage scheme. Large portions of the lowland end of the river are now over-widened. The river's embedded into the landscape, and we have these high flood levees that run for large portions of the channel length. We have unbelievable weed growth on the river. This is a weed that has newly colonised, and it's really taken off over the last sort of 40 years or so, to such an extent that it has actually overgrown completely some of the spawning habitats in the river. This, believe it or not, is probably one of our best spawning fords in the river bush. And this photograph was taken, I took it a couple of years ago in December time. You can see the weed more or less carpets the entire bed of the river. And it's a real impediment for spawning salmon. I watched a hen salmon try and cut a red through some of this weed, and she spent a good half hour, and she managed to de-weed the surface of the gravel. But because there's so much compaction of the gravel below the surface of the weed, because there's so much silt ingressed into this, she couldn't actually break through the surface. She was unsuccessful and had to move on. This is a major problem for us. We also have big issues with predation. Cormorant predation in particular is amazing on the river bush. And my old boss, Gershom Kennedy, looked at that back in the 80s and determined that we lost a potentially large proportion of our smolt run each year to predation. The reason being that the bush is close to one of the main breeding colonies for cormorants off the north coast of Ireland, and the numbers have increased dramatically over the last 50 years. What impact have these pressures had? Well, the smolt run from the 70s through to the mid-90s showed a general and consistent decline to a low point in 1995 when we only had 5,000 smolts to the trap. These are some electrofishing data from 1983, typical of these years in the early 80s. Each circle represents an electrofishing site. The red colours tend to indicate good or high abundance of knot plus salmon. And you can see in the 1980s, large numbers of salmon throughout the entire catchment, well up into the headwaters, into the tributaries and in the main stem. Compare that with 1996. Yellows indicate an absence. You can see that the entire top end of the river was devoid of fish. Fish production was focused and concentrated really in the main stem of the river. And to complement that, this is our conservation requirement on the bush from 1985 through to the 90s. And you can see we started to fail to attain our conservation requirement, our conservation limit, consistently through the 1990s. At that stage, the guys in the research station decided to implement an enhancement plan. This enhancement plan sought to use knot plus age class salmon produced in the hatchery at the station and to stock these fish into barren, underproductive freshwater habitats which historically supported fish. In other words, trying to compensate to some degree for the loss of spawning habitat, but also this restriction of fish production throughout the river. And some management objectives were set at that time. First of these was to increase smolt production from the river to a target of 20,000 fish. It was felt that this 20,000 target was reflective of a mean historical decent level of production from the river. Secondly, to try and assist the stock to consistently attain its conservation limit, and then critically to monitor the impact of these management actions. I'm going to skip through this pretty quick just to really show that there are challenges with stocking plans, and at the time they decided to try and address some of these stocking challenges. For example, overstocking wild fish with hatchery-produced fish isn't a good idea, so they used electrofishing data to identify gaps in recruitment where the stocking could be undertaken. An implementation of best practice was also undertaken. So a potted history of the stocking campaign on the bush between 1997 and 2007, just under 4 million knot plus salmon were stocked directly into freshwater habitats. The first 5 years of the programme, it was all unfed fry that were used. The second portion of the time series, fed fry were used in greater abundance. These fish were stocked out in August, September after a time in the hatchery. Now, one of the benefits of being on a monitored river is that you have some idea of biological characteristics of the stock that you're looking at. And on the bush, for each wild-spawned ova cohort, we have monitoring of the smolt production, and we can estimate the total smolt production resulting from any ova cohort, any wild-spawned ova cohort. We also can estimate the ova to smolt survival. And that's very useful because over a longer term, and we have a long-term data series on the bush, gives us an idea of variability in survival, variability in terms of ova to smolt survival. And we also have an idea of the stock recruitment relationship, this relationship that Ken introduced us to this morning, looking at smolt production from ova deposition levels. And this is useful because it allows us to model and predict out the number of fish, wild fish, that would be associated with any spawning deposition. So this graph shows the smolt output from annual ova cohorts. So the ova cohort spawned in 91. This is the total number of smolts produced from that cohort. So for the first 5 years, there was no stocking conducted, and you can see these black bars show you the actual number of smolts to the trap at Bushmills. Quite a bit of variability, as you would expect. Second 5 years, you'll see unfed fry were introduced to the system. Now, these clear box plots are our attempt to model, to estimate the contribution of wild-produced smolts. The difference between the actual number to the trap and the prediction should theoretically give you an idea of how much your stock material has influenced overall smolt production. And you'll see this 5-year period where unfed fry were used, the wild fish could have accounted for nearly all the production that came to the smolt trap. Interestingly, the third time period when fed fry were introduced to the scenario, you can see that the numbers produced to the trap actually outstripped even the most optimal projections of production from the wild spawning. And in fact, some of these years, that 20,000 smolt target was actually met. That's interesting. It's theoretical. We felt we had to ground truth some of this. And our colleagues at Queen's University, Paolo Prodal and his student Kathy Johnston, were able to take a look at unfed fry and try and estimate the survival rate of unfed fry to smolt. Our estimates based on the modelling approach suggested that the overall survival rate from unfed fry to smolt would be in the region of 0.5 to 1%. So they looked at some crossed material. They were able then to generate some fry of known genetic characteristics, stock those out, and then monitor the smolt run through the trap. And they used some, I'm not a geneticist, so I'll not even pretend to understand what they did here, but they used some genetic techniques to try and identify fish from the stocking. The take-home message is that the overall survival from unfed fry to smolt was around about 0.7%, which is in the ballpark to the theoretical figures we had tried to estimate. We followed that up then to look at fed fry survival, because it was the years when fed fry were introduced that we seemed to have this increase in overall smolt production to the river. So we set up an experiment in 2007, and we fin-clipped 30,000 summerlings, which were stocked out in the usual way in August, September. So this experimental group were stocked out. The areas were carefully selected after electrofishing surveys, and we stocked them typically in areas with no production of wild fish. And we picked up marked fish over the subsequent years at the smolt trap, and it allowed us then to estimate the survival rate from fed fry to smolt. Based on our modelling studies, we had estimated that survival rate should be in the region of around about 4% or greater. And this experiment gave us a figure of about 5%. So the management outcomes of all of this, I'll take you to the smolt production figure again. This was the early part of the time series that I showed you, to a low point in 95, numbers reduced. After the management plan, the numbers increased. However, for me, the story only starts to get interesting now. Okay, there were a few more smolts being produced from the river, but critically, the second management objective, the attainment consistently of conservation limit, didn't occur. The red box here indicates the years potentially influenced by stock material. We only hit conservation limit twice in that period of time. Why? Well, I think one of the benefits of our experiments, where we were able to get our hands on smolts that were produced from stocking, was that we were able to compare those stocked origin smolts against wild origin smolts. And we found something very, very interesting. The smolts emanating from the stocking were smaller. They had much lower condition factor, significantly lower, in fact, for the younger smolts. They showed differential run timing. The stocked origin smolts ran earlier than the wild smolts. And critically, they were younger. Most of the smolts derived from the summerling stockings, over 50% of them, were 1+, whereas in the river, naturally, most of our fish are 2+. I think these have great potential implications for subsequent marine survival, because we know from our ranching work on the bush, where we microtag and release smolts of known age, that older smolts survive better than younger smolts. Very clear picture from the bush. In addition, we know that fish, smolts that leave the river earlier, tend to survive less well than fish that leave the river a little bit later. So we probably contributed something to the smolt production target. We didn't consistently attain conservation limit, but we were able to monitor the outcome. And I think we've been able to think and reflect on this data, reflect on it, and we've come up with a few thoughts that I think would be useful to share with you. Firstly, whenever the program was set up, with the best will in the world, abundance was seen to be the important thing. Get the numbers of smolts up to 20,000, everything will be all right. And I think a message that's coming to me from this meeting is that abundance is not all important. Quality is very important. Stocking was a quick option for us in the bush. We had a hatchery, but it cannot and does not address the fundamental underlying habitat issues. It can't do that. It has risks, and my colleague Dennis Ensing is presently looking at the genetic aspects of this work, and hopefully we'll hear something about that before too long. And we think it's important to maximise production of wild spawn smolts with optimal fitness, and to do so involves the utilisation of other longer-term conservation tools. And back home, we're trying to maximise spawning escapement to rivers. Our local coastal fisheries have now ceased in the last couple of years. The river bush is catch and release in an effort to try and maximise wild spawning escapement. In addition, my colleagues in the department, particularly Mr. John Kane, who's out in the audience, are trying to grasp the thorny nettle of habitat. This is a massive, massive job, looking at the enhancement of spawning gravels, clearing weed. It's a thankless task. Even trying to bring some of these more marginal, previously drained habitats into some sort of production again through the addition of suitable bed materials. And here you can see an example of that. So my last slide, the future. The future for us, I feel, is about maximising wild smolt production, particularly through habitat management. And we have some work ongoing with our colleagues at Queen's University to actually look at overall lifetime fitness of stocked fish, to test out if these thoughts that we have about lower marine survival of stocked origin fish are true. So we have some collaborative work going on. Hopefully this has been a useful case study, and it'll add a little bit more to the conference. Thanks very much for your attention.